Ready? Okay, good morning. Last week, we finished off at the physical Zion, if you can remember. But there's a couple of really good questions that came up that I sort of wanted to address beforehand. One was from Terry, and Terry had a couple of really good comments about this physical place of Zion. One is I drew some V's on that hill that signifies the saddle between Zion and Moriah. And that's significant because, as Terry said last week, and I didn't know this, but that saddle or that cut between the two hills there was significantly bigger in the day of David. And they actually filled that in partway to make it easier to transport throughout the city. Okay? And that signifies, that's something that we're meant to see as a separation between our space and God's space as it is now on earth. Okay? It's not the way it was in Eden. Okay, but that's a good point that Terry brought up. Also, hey Tom, did something else happen? Am I doing that or you? You're doing it. Okay, good. And in Luke chapter 24, Terry mentioned that some of these verses show up in the New Testament. Well, a lot of them do. And I actually cut this slide out from the first week that we had. But look at this. Where was he? In Isaiah chapter 2. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Now that shows up in this... In Luke chapter 24 that we were talking about 2 weeks ago, remember where Jesus is talking about the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim? He's like, all of that's about me. All of it is about Jesus. Okay? And then he goes on to open their minds to understand the Scriptures. We see this in the Old Testament from Job and Psalm. And then he says, thus it is written that the Christ should suffer on the third day and rise from the dead, and that repentance for forgiveness of sins should be proclaimed in his name to all of the nations, beginning from Jerusalem. Now, what does that sound like? That last part in the green. That sounds just like what we were looking at with Isaiah, doesn't it? From out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Beginning from Jerusalem, all people groups. Now, that's from Isaiah, but it's also from Isaiah 49 and Malachi chapter 1 and Genesis 12 and Genesis 18, a blessing to all nations. Right? This is the way the apostles and the biblical authors quoted from the Old Testament. They didn't quote like we quote with quotation marks and citations and all this stuff. They quoted conceptually. Okay? That's how they did it. So they weren't, just look at the middle, that teal part. Thus it is written that the Christ should suffer on the third day and rise from the dead. Where does it say that the Messiah is going to die and then raise from the dead the third day in the Old Testament? Don't look up there. It doesn't say it anywhere, but it says it everywhere. If you start looking at the acts of redemption or the acts of propitiation or grace or substitutionary atonement salvation that happen after a 3-day period in the Old Testament, it's all over the place. Now, this is not a complete list. These are just some things that I came up with off the top of my head. But look at Genesis chapter 22. What happened there? Isaac was going up to the mountain to be sacrificed, and on the third day, going up to the mountain, a substitutionary atonement was made. God provided a substitutionary sacrifice for Isaac, right? We talked about that last week. What happened in Genesis 31? Jacob fled from Laban, and on the third day, he was found out and then delivered from his wrath. What happened in Genesis 42? Simon and Levi killed the Hivites. They put their wrath on the Hivites on the third day after their circumcision, after their sister had been raped. Remember? What happened that was 34. But what happened in Genesis 42? This is a big one, isn't it? Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers, was, the second in command in Egypt, and his brothers were literally starving to death in their own land. So they came down to seek salvation, and deliverance from this famine, and they didn't recognize Joseph, but Joseph recognized him. And then he put them in jail for 3 days. And they thought they were dead for 3 days, only to come out of that 3-day period with salvation. Okay, we see this in Leviticus. We see this in Joshua. Rahab and the spies. She hid the spies for 3 days, right? Oh, Exodus 19. We forgot about that. God came down from Mount Sinai after the 3rd day and gave the law and the Torah and the covenant to the people of Israel. We see it in Samuel. The last one that I'll mention here is in 2 Samuel chapter 2. Remember how 2 Samuel starts off? What just happened? Saul died, right? Saul died. They hung his body up on the gates. They took some guy from a different ethnicity. I forget if it was an Amorite or an Ammonite or something, but he took his crown, and then after a 3-day period, he gave the crown to David, the true anointed of God. So in Israel, there was no king for 3 days. And then the true king was anointed on the 3rd day. What does that sound like? Sounds like the cross to me. So these are just some sort of things that I had took out, but Terry reminded me of. And I mean, he's right to say that they're important. Okay? The second thing that was sort of brought up was the hills and the elevation. Bill brought up the elevation of the hills. And, Zion is what? What is it Zion the type for? Do you remember? The garden in Eden. It's the dwelling place of man. It was literally the dwelling place of David, but it's metaphorically, it's the dwelling place of God's people. And that's a little bit lower than Moriah, which is the metaphorical dwelling place of God. That's where the temple is. That's where the veil is. That's where the Holy of Holies is. That's where the glory of the Lord filled in the day of Simon, literally. And that's just I think it's only like 10 feet higher in elevation than Mount Zion. But what's significantly higher than Mount Moriah and Mount Zion? The Mount of Olives. Remember, the mountain that's east of the city. So this is a picture of the city of Jerusalem that you can see there from the Mount of Olives. And what's significant about that is 2 things that Terry and Bill were sort of both pulling out of this. One is you can't see Jerusalem until you get really close to it from the road of Jericho, as you're going to Jericho, because there's a great big mountain in front of it, or a great big hill. But when you get really close to Jerusalem, you not only can see the city of Jerusalem for the first time, when Jesus was going to the cross, literally, but you can see the whole city when you get up on that prominence. You can see the whole thing, because you're at a place of elevation, so you're looking down on the city, right? And where did Jesus ascend? On the Mount of Olives, which is higher than both of those places. So Jesus could see the whole city when he was coming into the city to do his work and to be crucified. And then when he ascended, the whole city could see him. Right? These are significant things. But, I mean, there's just so many details that it's hard to decide what to talk about, what to cut out, and all of that. Any questions about any of that? Just review from last week. Now, if you guys got any questions at home, I know a lot of people are watching from home. If you have any questions, text Tom. Tom's here, and he'll read your questions, and I'll see if somebody else has an answer or something. But go ahead and do that. So now we're going to come to this place. This is where we were left off last week. We talked about the metaphorical. We talked about the physical. Now we're talking about the spiritual place. And Acts chapter 1 is a good place to jump off of that point. Now we could talk about a million places in the Psalms and the prophets and in the New Testament that talk about this spiritual place of Zion. But we don't have enough time to talk about all the places. So let's just look at Hebrews here. Hebrews in chapter 11 was telling us that Abraham was looking for a place that has foundations, that is a city that builder and maker is God, right? And then he tells us what it is. We don't have the physical, the things that could be touched or heard or seen or decay away. Think about that. What we have been given is the spiritual. We have come to a spiritual and eternal city of God. That city is Zion, or the heavenly Jerusalem, or the New Jerusalem, as Revelation tells us. And then look at Revelation. This is John being given a vision of this spiritual city. Then I looked and beheld, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him the 144,000, signifying the people of God, this new family of God, who had his name, of the Father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the roar of many waters and like the sound of thunder. Now, these are concepts that we've been talking about for the last 2 weeks. These are themes that run through the length of the Bible. We should be very familiar with this language, right? Because it's throughout the Bible. I just highlighted some of the things that stick out. But written on their foreheads, the name of God, where does that come from? Well, we see that in Deuteronomy 6, right? Speak these words to your children. They shall be signs in your hands, they shall be frontlets between your eyes, right? That is the Shema. We know that. Ezekiel, in Ezekiel chapter 9, talks about this God stamping his people out, the people that were abhorrent from the abominations that were being done in the city at the time. Those people that were terrified and that knew that those were abominations, they were to have a stamp, a sign put on their head so the angel knew them. Okay, that's how the people of God are talked about through many places, not just those two places, but many places throughout the Bible. Okay, this is all one story. It's the same story and over and over and over again, but it's told in a lot of different ways. And you got to know the whole thing sort of at once. Okay, and then, we talked about this last week, right? We sing songs about this. We talked about marching to Zion last week. So I won't bring that up a whole lot. But look at this song. There's a habitation. We sing this pretty frequently, I think, don't we? There's a habitation built by the living God. That's from Genesis 1 and 2. But it's also from Hebrews 11, isn't it? The city that has foundations, right? For all and every nation who seek the grand abode. That's from Genesis 12 and Genesis 18, isn't it? You shall be a blessing to all the nations. But it's also from Matthew 28 and Luke 24 that we were just talking about. Go out to all of the nations, every ethnicity, right? I long thy gates to see. How many gates are in Zion? According to Revelation 21, there's 12. There's a gate for every member of God's family. 12 signifies God's family, right? The tribes of Israel or the sons of Jacob. That is the people of God. 12 times 12 times 1,000. 144,000. There is a gate for everyone to come in. All of God's people that have that mark on them. Okay? And what does Jesus call himself in John chapter 10? The gate. No one goes to the Father except through me. I am that gate. Right? No wars, no desolations, not shall ever move a stone. What is Jesus? We talked about Luke chapter 19 last week. Do you remember that? So Jesus was riding in the triumphal entry, right, on the colt, and he wept over the city. Why did he weep over the city? Because he saw its destruction. And that's when he prophesied that not a stone will be left unturned. Now, it's sort of interesting why a stone will not be left unturned. Like, this was a bitter war that lasted several years between the Romans and the Jews, the Jewish-Roman wars. And they were pretty ticked off by the time they got to Jerusalem. So they just had enough. They burnt the city down. They burnt the place clear to the floor. What that did was, remember that the temple was built with a lot of precious stones and gold in the shape of like fruit trees signifying the garden. There's a lot of gold in Genesis chapter 2, right? So there was a lot of gold and silver and precious metals in the temple. Well, when that temple got caught on fire, all of the gold went to the bottom and it went straight to the foundation. It melted and it sunk into the foundation. So the Romans, they sort of shot themselves in the foot. They had to take all those stones out to get the gold because they wanted the gold. So he was being prophetic there, but that's where this line comes from, right? The city of Zion is not going to be like that. Not a stone will not be turned. No night, no sorrow, no death, no decay, no yesterday, no morrow, but one eternal day. That's from the inclusio of the Bible. This place in Genesis 2 and Revelation 22, that's a big inclusio that holds the Bible together. Those two chapters hold everything in. They're very similar. They talk about the same things, the same concepts, and that's where that comes from. There will be no night, and there will be no need for a sun, because God is the light. That's what John tells us. And then, obviously, there's no death, no decay in Genesis 2 until we see the fall and the rebellion of mankind. How do you write a song like that? You got to know the whole story, don't you? You got to know the whole story. So we talked about this too. I just want to come back to this real briefly. We see this place of God's dwelling, from his throne, from his temple, God's space, where God is. This is where water comes from, okay? We see it in Ezekiel, we see it in Revelation, we see it in Genesis chapter 2, we see it everywhere. But I just wanted to come back to this slide because you see why the water is important? Do you see why Amos brings us back to that juxtaposition between Zion and Carmel? Do you see why Amos uses the word wither? Right? I didn't tell you why, but I gave you all the pieces, right? I just sort of took a puzzle and just threw it on the table and see, here it is, right? But you got to sort of put these pieces together, okay? Remember, this is a judgment section of Amos, covenantal lawyer, right? This is a judgment proclamation, okay? And this is how he begins his story, Amos, okay? I was reading this through the first time, and I'm like, Carmel withers sort of sounds weak, doesn't it? I mean, withers sounds a little bit impotent, I think. Think about, Tom, me and you are going to have a fight, okay? We're both boxers, and on Saturday we're having a fight, and at the press conference, I'm like, man, Tom, wait until I get my hands on you Saturday night. In that ring, you're going to wither. You're thinking, well, that doesn't sound too bad, right? I mean, I might be a little dehydrated from the weight cut, but I mean, why does he even say that? I mean, where's the fire? Where's the brimstone? Where's the destruction? Where's the weeping and gnashing of teeth? Well, he's going to come to that, but he chooses to begin his poem this way. This is how he sets his tone, with the word wither. And the reason is because the water is important. The water is important. The origination of the water is important. But this is how Amos chooses to set the tone of the body of his work, what he is trying to tell us, because the water is important. It is life-giving. Remember, living water, water of life, both physically and spiritually. The metaphor is significant. Okay? It flows from the very presence of God. In the beginning, at Eden, remember, it flowed from God. It watered the place where man was. It gave mankind, humanity, life. In the rocks, in the wilderness, that Paul called Christ, right? The prophets talked about this ad nauseum, all the way through Revelation, right? And literally from the body of Jesus as he hung on a Roman execution rack, water came out. Remember Psalm 22? We call Psalm 22 the Psalm of the Cross, don't we? A lot of times. I mean, that's what Christians call it anyway, and I think it's pretty appropriate. What does it say? I am poured out like water. Okay? That's why the water was noted when it came out of the body of Jesus as that Roman stabbed him with a spear in his side. It's not to tell us that he died of asphyxiation, which is a true statement. It's not to tell us that, though. It's to tell us that he is literally Yahweh. It's to tell us that he is literally the presence of God in human flesh, and that it is from him whom the water comes. Okay? The temple, right? The throne of God, that's him. That is the Lamb. That is who Jesus is. You see how profound that is? How much more profound that is than saying that, there's going to be destruction and just take my word for it. Here's the earthquake, whatever. That's saying something, I think. That is a very, very deep 4-line poem, that there's a lot there. So what is Carmel, right? Brad told us a couple of weeks ago that Carmel's the garden, right? The name means garden, right? But that's ironic, isn't it? Is Carmel the garden here? Of course not. Carmel's withering, right? Carmel is not the garden. Think of the history that happened on Carmel. We talked about 1 Kings chapter 18 last week a little bit, right? We're going to talk about it more in just a second. Carmel's not the garden. Carmel's not the seed of woman. Carmel's the seed of the serpent, right? Carmel is Babylon. Carmel's Sodom and Gomorrah. It's Egypt. Carmel is the figurative sons of man in Noah's day. Remember we talked about these two lines. You know, this, the seed of woman's the seed of serpent, and we get all these types, and they get closer and closer and closer. Not this, not this, not this, a little bit like this. And then when they cross, when those lineages converge, we see Jesus. They converge right on Jesus. And it's not that. It's this. This is what we're supposed to see. That's a profound way of telling a story. And that's what Carmel is. It's not the type, it's the antithesis. It's the seed of the serpent. Now, obviously, water does not come from Carmel, right? Remember, this is a depiction, but there's 3 jugs laying around there. Can you guys see a 4th jug? I only see 3. But what did Elijah do before he offered that sacrifice up? He put 12 stones around that altar, signifying the people of God, right? That God did not forget, even though those people had rebelled against him and transgressed. God does not forget them, okay? He put 12 stones around that altar. Then he dug a trench. And then he had people bring water to that place because there was no water there. Remember, this is a drought, okay? He had them bring water with 4 jugs 3 times. And water wet the altar, and then it filled that trench around. And then what did God do? He dried the water, right? The water withered. It turned brown. These are the translations that are used in Amos chapter 1, verse 2. Okay? Because water doesn't come from Carmel. It comes from God. And then after God did that, where'd the water come from? After 1 Kings chapter 18. The water came from the sky. It came from heaven. It came from Eden. It came from, heaven is the way that the Jewish authors talk about God's space. That's where God is. God's up here, we're down here. The water came from his space. This is an act of redemption. Think about that. 3, right? The water came 3 times. What happened after 3 times? God sent water from his space. Redemption came to the land. Even though those people were still rebellious and transgressed. This is one of the worst times of Israel's history, right? The evil King Ahab and Jezebel, right? Even though those people were still in rebellion, God is giving them patience. He is giving them water of life out of his good grace. This is amazing, I think. This is truly amazing. But you got to know the whole story. You got to know the whole story all at once, and boy, is it long. So, of course, Carmel is not the garden, okay? The water comes from Eden. It comes from Zion. It comes from God's space. It comes from heaven. It comes from, the new heavenly Jerusalem. It comes from the direct person of God, Jesus, even as he hung on the cross. So what did God, so we already talked about that. And Carmel represents a false high place, okay? So the last thing that I want to talk about is this. A couple of weeks ago, I made some mentions about wells and redemptive acts that happen over water and over wells. And Elisa was like, you should have talked about that woman in John chapter 4. I said, well, I wasn't quite there yet. I'm taking a lot longer with this introduction than I was supposed to. So I apologize for that. It's easier if you get all this material at the same time, rather than being separated by weeks. But I apologize, okay? You're just going to have to remember through the weeks as we go through this. But I'll finish today with the introduction, I promise. Okay? So remember this story in John chapter 4. This is amazing, isn't it? It's amazing for a lot of reasons. One, what just happened before John chapter 4 in John chapter 3? Remember? Yeah, hey, before we get into this, any questions, Tom? Okay. Yeah, Nicodemus, right? So think about the contrast that is. Nicodemus to this lady, John chapter 3 to John chapter 4, right? You have Nicodemus, the highest of society, right? He was literally a ruler of the rulers. He had authority to speak for the ruling class in Jerusalem. He's like the top dog, you know? And who sought out who in that circumstance? It was Nicodemus who sought out Jesus. Nicodemus came to Jesus. And when did he come to him? At night. He came to him in the middle of the night, didn't he? Probably for a lot of reasons, but one is because he was embarrassed to be seen with him. It would hurt his reputation or whatever. You know, a lot of reasons. We won't speculate a whole lot. But compare that to this story, this woman. Who sought this woman out? It was Jesus. Jesus sought this woman out. When did he seek her out? In the middle of the day. When the sun was at its brightest is when he sought her. Nicodemus was the highest of society. This woman makes a point to tell Jesus that she is so low in society that he shouldn't even be asking her for a drink of water. Right? Because when she touches the thing to get him water, it's going to be contaminated. Right? I mean, it's amazing. Think about the contrast that is. John situates these stories back to back for a reason. Right? He tells us that in, I think, chapter 21. That he does that for a reason. Now, by the way, how does this conversation begin? Water. He begins this. The first thing he says, "Can I have a drink of water?" And then he begins to tell her about water of life that he can give. This living water, this source of living water that only comes from God. Right? We know that from the prophets. Maybe she doesn't, but he explains this thing. And then she tells him that she's, you know, the lowest of society. He shouldn't be seen with her or whatever, you know. And we're not told that Jesus says this. And then she says, you know, Jesus tells her that something that only she would know. That she is, you know, a serial adulterer, and the man that she's with now is not her husband. So she perceives that he's a prophet. And she says, oh, well, if you're a prophet, why don't you tell me what mountain we're supposed to worship on? Because my ancestors worshipped on this mountain, Mount Carmel, for hundreds of years. But you Jews say that we're only supposed to worship in Jerusalem. And Jesus doesn't say this in the text, but any Jew is going to say, well, of course that's where you're supposed to worship God. Haven't you read Deuteronomy chapter 12 or Deuteronomy chapter 14 or 16? This place of God's choosing, right? This place that God chose from all the tribes of Israel to make his name dwell permanently. That's where the temple was. That's where Mount Moriah was, for goodness sakes, right? That's where you got to worship God. But she could have come back easily with her reply, couldn't she? She's not allowed there. This woman, these people, literally didn't have access to worship God in the correct way, right? That's a good point. Now, Jesus proceeds to tell her that there's a time coming when it's not going to be about mountains or temples. It's not going to be about Jerusalem. It's not going to matter who you are or where you're from, only that you worship God in spirit and in truth. Now, this is amazing. And we don't think about this a lot. But because, you know, we're reading the Bible from a Western perspective, you know, as Americans, we don't really come to the table with the presuppositions that these people had, culturally speaking and societally, you know. But this, I'm telling you, this is amazing, okay? That it's not going to be about mountains and temples and high places. That is category shattering. Think about what Jesus did in Mark chapter 1. He touched the leopard, right? He touched the leopard and he cleansed the leopard. That's what it says. Now, we gloss over that really easily, way too easily. But that is shocking. Those people didn't have a category for that. For thousands of years, it wasn't the clean that made the unclean clean. It was the unclean that contaminated the clean, right? And for Jesus to reach out and touch that guy was amazing. And for him to reach out and touch that guy and for him to be healed immediately, they didn't have a category for that, okay? And this woman doesn't have a category for this, okay? This is two things here. One, this is shocking, okay? These people's religious societies have revolved around temples and high places for thousands of years. Not just in the day of the nation of Israel, but even Abraham. You see Abraham, Noah, all these, they've revolved around temples, high places, veils between themselves and God. And that's how they accessed God. You worked and you strived and you went up the mountain and you failed. You never could make it up that mountain, metaphorically. Some people couldn't make it up that mountain literally. She wasn't allowed in the temple, remember? She wasn't allowed up there, literally. What is Jesus saying? These people don't have a category for. That's amazing. That's shocking, okay? The second thing that this is this is incredibly comforting. Okay? This woman was an outcast among outcasts, right? Not only was she a woman, she was a Samaritan. Not only was she a Samaritan, she was a serial adulterer, right? She was rejected by everybody. Probably everybody that knew her didn't like her. She was rejected by, I'm sure, her family, her parents, adult children, if she had any. She probably had to pay a premium in the marketplace because people didn't want to do business with her. Okay? And don't think that we don't have people like this in our own society. But we have this thin veneer of civilization in front of us, and we sort of sequester those people away, don't we? Okay? But this woman is in every society, ours included. Okay? But the God of creation came down that mountain for not just all of humanity, but for her. He came down for her. And it was Jesus who sought her out alone in the middle of the day to give her this message and to give her this words. Right? Compare that to what happened in the previous chapter with Nicodemus, the highest of society. That is nothing short of amazing and comforting. Tell me that's not amazing. Tell me that's not comforting. I don't think that we're shocked by this as much as what we should be. So it's obvious that Jesus is not talking about the physical place, right? He's not talking about the metaphorical place. He's not talking about the temple. He's talking about this place in Hebrews that Hebrews tells us Abraham was looking for. This city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. That's what he's looking for. He's talking to this woman about the spiritual place. I mean, he says that much. He's spirit and truth, right? This is amazing. And 800 years before this, God sent an earlier prophet to this woman's ancestors, to this exact location, this land, Israel, to this woman's forefathers. He sent a prophet, a nobody shepherd from an obscure place, to remind them of a covenant and a promise and a mountain and a seed, and that there is a God who lives in Israel. He was a covenantal lawyer, and his name was Amos. He reminds them that the God of the universe is faithful and will never break his covenant, even when it broke him. Now, how can Amos make that claim? That God is faithful. How can he make that? I mean, he lives on the other side of the cross. He doesn't see this. He doesn't see this woman. He doesn't see Jesus. He doesn't see the actual body that was casting the shadow that he was talking about. Because of the record of God. It's because Yahweh has a record. He has a record with Abraham. He has a record with Isaac, with Jacob. Right? We see redemption from Genesis chapter 3 when that first animal was sacrificed to cover the nakedness of Adam and Eve, all the way to the cross. There's a million jumping off points that we see all along the story, okay? And Amos is right in the middle of that, and he sees them clear as day. And he's reminding those people of all of those times. He's reminding them of the covenant, okay? But also, what God has done. Remember in Joseph, using Joseph to redeem the family into salvation, into Egypt from the famine, redeeming them through Moses out of Egypt, out of bondage. He's done this in numerous places. And all these places are written about thoroughly in the Torah, where Amos is getting this. But most importantly, Amos can make this claim because of what he has been told. God is faithful. Okay? Now, You'll notice a lot of my slides are coming from Ezekiel and some of the prophets, because if you're not doing the congregational Bible reading, it's in the Ezekiel right now. And so look at what Ezekiel says here. In chapter 16, he writes this really long chapter. And where is Ezekiel right now when he receives these early visions? He's sitting at the canal in Babylon, in the Chebar Canal, I think, right? He's literally in exile, right? I think it's close to his 30th birthday. He was trained to be a priest. He was supposed to be a priest. He's sitting at this canal, this probably dirty, nasty canal with a bunch of these exiles. On his birthday, he's supposed to become a priest, and he's in exile. But look at what he writes. In chapter 16, he writes this really long chapter to remind the people about what God has done for them. He redeemed them. He saved Abraham's family. He made Abraham a great nation. He saved them out of Egypt. He brought them to the promised land. He fed them with water and manna in the desert. He's done all of this stuff, which is just unbelievable. And then they repaid him by transgression. I mean, remember, in Ezekiel's times, they were not following Yahweh at all. That's what led to the exile, right? They were following the nations. They were following these gods. It got so bad, they were offering their children on the idol of Molech. They were offering children sacrifices at this time, right? But what does Ezekiel say at the end of this long chapter? Look at verse 60, right? Yet I will remember my covenant with you. That's unbelievable. That's what a covenant is. A covenant cannot be broken. Okay? And even though all of the wickedness, rebellion, transgression, God remembers his covenant. And Ezekiel is told that, and he believes that, while sitting at a canal as an exile. That's amazing. Ezekiel doesn't see this. He sees this, but he doesn't see the antitype. He doesn't see the body that's casting that shadow. This is what Amos is all about. This is the covenant. I forgot to ask you last week, Wally, what is Amos about? It's about a covenant. It's about a covenant. That's what it's about. Never lose sight of that. The whole Bible is about this covenant that is how a holy and righteous God can dwell with an unholy and unrighteous, sinful people. Now, we don't think of Amos as the gospel very often. We talked about this the first week, right? And that's a mistake, because according to Paul in 2 Timothy, right, what does Paul tell us? That this Tanakh that Timothy grew up reading is what? It can make us wise for salvation through Jesus Christ, right? That's what Paul tells us in 2 Timothy. And it's a mistake that we don't see it that way sometimes. It's a shame that we don't see it that way sometimes. Because everything, I'm telling you, every single precept that Amos stands on is the good news for humanity. Just think about that for a minute. If there is no covenantal lawyer, if there's no covenantal lawyer, there's no covenant. If there's no covenant, there's no seed. If there's no seed, there's no Savior. If there's no Savior, there's no priest. There's no king, there's no kingdom. If there's no kingdom, there's no city. There's no habitation for us. There's no Zion. There is only a place for us to dwell eternally because of that covenant and because of the God who cut that covenant. And because that God, as Ezekiel is telling us here, is faithful and will remember. Now, I don't get into all of this, but this verbiage, I will remember, that God uses, God says that repeatedly throughout the Tanakh. He says he remembers Noah, right? He remembers Rachel. He remembers, what's Samuel's mom's name? Samuel's mother? Hannah. He remembers Hannah. Okay? But this verbiage is found throughout the Torah. And these are all these breadcrumbs that we're talking about. These breadcrumbs that lead us to the seed, that lead us to the propitiation, that lead us to this way. that we're given. There first has to be a covenant made with the God of the universe, that evil will one day be defeated by the seed of woman, and that all nations will be blessed through him, like Abraham's told in Genesis chapter 12 and Genesis chapter 15, and Genesis chapter 18, I mean. This is the gospel that the people of Amos's day desperately needed to hear. This is the gospel that the woman at the well desperately needed to hear, and her ancestors. This is the gospel that the people of this day need to hear. This is universal. Okay, the Old Testament, remember, the Old Testament's not a message of the past by people of the past, of a largely forgotten God of the past. It is for the covenantal people of God eternally. Okay? In this story that we remember and retell every week, that there is a God who lives in Israel and has taken up residency in Israel. You see, in the former days, there was an ethnic group. There was a mountain, there was a temple, a high place. There was all of these types. But in these latter days, we're told that the temple of God is the body of the church. And his Spirit, capital S, his Spirit, has taken up residency within his people. Okay? That is the temple. Okay? Remember, what John says in Revelation, there's no need for a temple. Because in Revelation, when the metaphorical Eden and the garden that are separated, when that's restored, when those two places come back together, there's no need for a temple. There's no need for a veil or separation. Right? I think you could fit in justification somewhere in there, Nathan. Right? We have been justified. We have been made holy. Okay? Not yet. It's not about temples or mountains, as Jesus told this woman in John chapter 4, because God has come down from that mountain, and he has moved into his people to regenerate them with a new spirit from above. This great story of redemption and restoration is one that we take in and eat weekly, reminding us of the sacrifice that was made and the propitiation that was made on our behalf, reminding us of this covenant that Amos is talking about. This is what Amos is doing, reminding the people of the past and the people of the future, our day, of this covenant that God, the God of the universe, cut with humanity. Any questions about that? Anybody? Okay. So, that's the end of the introduction through verse 2. Okay. The rest of this is going to go a little bit faster, hopefully. You might notice that I use this slide sort of repetitively. Before we start, we've been doing this for a while, haven't we? Before we start a book of the Bible, we watch these Bible Project videos. They're like 5 minutes. They're pretty good. I like them. I'm not saying they're not scripture, okay? But they're a good way to a jumping off point, so to speak, to begin a new book of the Bible. Because for some of us, it's a bit of unfamiliar territory. We don't go to these books as frequently as what we should, I think. So plus, if you got kids, they're great because they're sort of in cartoon format. And we talk about these it's like, hey, Wednesday we're starting a new book of the Bible, new cartoon. You know. How old was Joey? Was he like 1.5 or 2 when he watched the Genesis one? He watched it like 200 times, doesn't he? Maybe more. So right now we're going to be beginning this section right here. This section of oracles. Okay, that's often called the oracle section of Amos. Chapters 1 and 2. And for next week, if you want to go through chapter 1, we'll probably spend a week and a half or 2 weeks there. And what he's doing is he's giving these oracles, these "Thus saith the Lord," from God to the nations that surround Israel, and then finally to Israel. Okay? So that's where we are. And these series of oracles have a specific pattern to them, don't they? Maybe some of you have read these recently. If you're in the Congregational Bible reading you have, I think it was June, was it? Was it June? You're a little bit ahead, but I think it was probably June or so. Not too long ago, Remember, Amos was one of the first of these prophets, maybe the first of these covenantal lawyer prophets that will come up in this. Okay, remember. And this is written in poetic form, so it's redundant, repetitive. We see some of the same things over and over again. Now, the first and the last of this sort of has this more familiar tone to it. Thus saith the Lord, that's the oracle part. I think we're pretty familiar with that. Fire, we're pretty familiar with that too. I think we sort of know. But the other two, this threes and the fours and the transgressions, we're going to spend a little bit more time on that. And I'll see if I can get through the threes and the fours. This is the most difficult one, I think. I'll see if I can get through that today. So what does this mean? For 3 transgressions of Damascus and for 4. Do you know what that is? Threes and fours? That's a Hebrew idiom. It's a figure of speech. Okay? We have idioms. Kill him with kindness, right? If I say I'm going to kill you with kindness, does that mean I'm going to kill you? It means the opposite. It means quite the opposite. But if you are, I don't know, a Chinese person maybe, and if you're learning English as a second language and you're reading that, you're thinking, man, it's about to get violent up in here, right? You got to understand the culture and the language in which they exist. And this is one of those things. We read the threes and the fours, and that we sort of gloss over that, and it's like, well, whatever, you know. But this is this Hebrew idiom. And this Hebrew expression or idiom that is used several places throughout the Bible, not just in Amos chapter 1 and chapter 2, and it's all over the place. But this is the first place that it's found, and the first place that we come to is significant because it's significant because it's the first place that it's used. And second, it's significant because it is God who is using it. In Exodus chapter 34, God is the first person to use this expression in the Hebrew Bible. Okay? This is where God gave the covenant. Moses went up to the mountain, got the 10 tablets, and the people rebelled, made a statue of gold of the, worshipped idolatry, basically. And then Moses broke the tablets, and he goes back up to the mountain, makes propitiation for the nation of Israel. Don't destroy them. Don't start over with me, right? Because of your name. And Moses tells God, I want to see your glory. And God says, you can't see my glory. It'll kill you. Okay, you're too corrupt. Even Moses is too corrupt to see the glory of God. It would kill him. But he says, you can see my leaving you. You can see the back half of me leaving you. So he puts Moses in a mountain, in a cleft, and he goes in front of him. And as he's going in front of Moses and covering him with his hand so he doesn't die, he says this saying to Moses. Now, we're not going to talk about this whole saying because the part that we want to talk about is the threes and the fours. But it's all wrapped up. It's intertwined, okay? But to save time, we're just going to talk about this expression. Now, the King James has, and I'll just read it here first, keeping steadfast love, just to keep context, I guess. Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the 3rd and the 4th generation. Now, the part that we're going to be looking at is this second part. And some of your Bibles have this in indentation, like it's poetry, okay? Not everybody's does, but the New Living does, the Berean Study Bible, some other ones. The King James Bible, and I think that the New American Standard, has that last word, generations, in italics. And the reason is because that word generation is not in there. Do you remember what the Hebrew word for generation is? I know you've heard it before. There's 2 of them. One is toledot. Oh, the toledot, yeah. And so we've talked about that a million times, right? Ted July has talked about that a million times. And there's another one that I don't remember. But neither one of those is used here. It's in italics because the King James, New American Standard, whatever, a lot of translations put it in because it's implied. And I think it is implied. I think that's appropriate, okay? Because of the context that you see there. Now, we're supposed, and some translations put generations at the beginning too, keeping steadfast love for thousands of generations. I think that's appropriate too, because what we're supposed to do is divide this poem into two halves, and it has a chiastic structure to it. If you remember, chiasms are Hebrew poems that are divided into two halves, and the first half mirrors the second half symmetrically. Okay, so this is what it looks like: A, B, B prime, A prime. They can take on various forms and various lengths, but this is basically what it is. So A is a mirror of A prime, B is a mirror of B prime, and the top section, A and B together, are meant to be compared to B prime and A prime. Okay, so I think it's appropriate the generations to put on both sides of that. And before we get into this in too depth, I just want to point out something really cool here. And look at in B, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Have you seen those words together before in the Hebrew Bible? You have. Because the Hebrew language has a very unique way of describing the human condition. Okay? The Hebrew Bible uses three words mainly, to describe what's wrong with the human condition. Paul tells us that in Romans that all have fallen short of the glory of God, right? But fallen in what way? I mean, we have a bunch of words too, but we don't use words routinely to describe the human condition the way that the Jews did. And the Greek language is capable of doing. So according to the Hebrew Bible, these words, iniquity, transgression, and sin, are the three ways that humans have fallen and humans are corrupted by sin. And they should be translated differently. Sometimes they're not. In some Bible translations, it should, like iniquity should never be translated as sin, and sin should never be translated as transgression. Okay, the word transgression is pesha, and it never should be translated as sin. It's not sin. It's different. The word sin is chata'ah, and that never should be translated as iniquity because it's not. It's something different. Okay? But sometimes the different translations sort of get them mixed up and talk about them differently and interchange them a little bit. That's not the way it should be. The Hebrews would not have had a category for that. Okay? But these words describe the comprehensive fallen nature of man and how we have corrupted ourselves. And we're going to talk about transgression, next week probably. But it's so interesting to me that God tells us here, I think this is the first time, that his forgiveness and his mercy is comprehensive. Okay? He doesn't just forgive sin or just transgression. He forgives everything that's wrong with you. He forgives. His forgiveness and mercy and grace is comprehensive. That's amazing. David knew something about comprehensive forgiveness, didn't he? These are poems by David. Blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man against whom Yahweh counts no iniquity, and whose spirit there is no deceit. After he sinned with Bathsheba, now his sin with Bathsheba was a comprehensive sin. He broke almost every law on the table of the Ten Commandments, okay? I mean, it wasn't just adultery. It was adultery, it was murder, it was deception, it was lying, it was covering up of a crime. This was a big, big fall. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, your covenant love. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. Job uses the same language. Micah and Daniel both talk about this. They talk about it in the past tense, that God does, and he is willing to pardon iniquity, pass over transgression, and cast out our sins into the depths of the sea. Daniel chapter 9, this is sort of interesting. I mean, a lot of times we get bogged down in this apocalyptic literature, and we get in over our heads, because you got to know, I mean, this is sort of technical stuff, but I think a lot of times people want to talk about this apocalyptic stuff. What does the 70 weeks mean? And they get out a newspaper and a globe and search the internet about Donald Trump and all this other stuff and figure out where we are in this 70-week program. And they're just not even like, look, don't miss that God brings everlasting righteousness. by putting a finish to transgression and to put an end to sin. And he atones for iniquity. That's way more profound. Okay? That's really profound. Now coming back, there's 2 levels of understanding to this. Look at B and B prime. Now, does God forgive our sins and iniquity and transgression? Or does he by no means clear the guilty? Is his steadfast love for thousands of generations? Or does he visit the iniquity on the generations, fathers and children and grandson? What is it? Is it one or the other? That's sort of confusing if we read that like that. But remember, this is Hebrew poetry. This is a chiasm. Okay? There's different levels of understanding here. How can these things both be true at the same time? How can A and B be harmonized with A prime and B prime? This is now just look at A and A prime. If you had to put on a scale God's covenant everlasting love and his wrath or his judgment in A prime, what side does the scale tip towards? Is it thousands or is it, let's say, 3 generations? It's thousands, right? His covenant love is much more of a pulling force than his vengeful wrath force, okay? But he cannot be loving if he is not also just. And that's what A prime is talking about, okay? And by the way, thousands, that term thousands, are we, yeah. So I think I'll just cut it off here, and I was hoping to get through this, this word, the 3s and 4s, but we'll leave that for next week, I guess. Any questions about any of that? Okay.